Reading the Times for Tuesday, February 4th, 2020. Delays mar Iowa caucuses as Democrats start nominating process. A complete mess. Still no results from Iowa caucus. Democratic candidates tried to spin the chaotic situation at the Iowa caucuses and campaigned in New Hampshire as they awaited the results. A night that was supposed to bring clarity to the Democratic presidential contest turned into a long ordeal of confusion and delays on Monday, as the Iowa Democratic Party failed to report results from more than a handful of precincts for hours after the state's famed caucuses began. Eventually, in a 1 a.m. conference call with reporters, Troy Price, the Iowa Democratic Party chairman, said results would not begin to be released until sometime on Tuesday. Beijing sees major test as donors to China close and coronavirus deaths surpass SARS. China's Communist Party leadership called the month-old coronavirus epidemic a major test on Monday, as other nations escalated efforts to isolate China, unnerving China's stock market, depressing global oil prices, and raising new anxiety about the world's most populous country. The growing global move to effectively cut off China's 1.4 billion people came as government officials reported the new coronavirus strain had killed more in mainland China, 425 as of Tuesday morning, than the SARS outbreak in 2002 and 2003, confirming it as one of the deadliest epidemics in recent Chinese history, even as Chinese officials tried to reassure their own public that shortages of medical supplies were being addressed and that food prices were stable. The spillover effects of China's isolation reverberated throughout the Chinese stock market, which had been closed since January 23rd for the Lunar New Year holiday. China, desperate to stop coronavirus, turns neighbor against neighbor. These outcasts are from Wuhan, the capital of Hubei province, where a rapidly spreading viral outbreak has killed more than 420 people in China and sent fear rippling around the world. They're only working to separate Wuhan people from Nanjing people, Mr. Li said. Why did you come back to Wuhan? You should have stayed there. You Wuhan dog, she recalled him saying. Democrats and White House rest cases as impeachment sputters toward verdict. In their final appeals in President Trump's impeachment trial, House Democrats argued on Monday that he had corrupted the presidency and would continue to put American interests at risk if the Senate failed to remove him from office. The only appropriate result here is to acquit the president and to leave it to the voters to choose their president. What is President Trump accused of doing? What is President Trump accused of doing? He's accused of pressuring the president of Ukraine to investigate his political rivals, including former Vice President Joseph R. Biden Jr., a potential Democratic opponent in the 2020 election, in exchange for military aid and access to the White House. Japan races to build new coal-burning power plants despite the climate risks. Britain, the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution, is set to phase out coal power by 2025, and France has said it will shut down its coal power plants even earlier, by 2022, while older coal plants will start retiring, eventually reducing overall coal dependency. The country still expects to meet more than a quarter of its electricity needs from coal in 2030. Japan is an anomaly among developed economies, said Yukari Takamura, an expert in climate policy at the Institute for Future Initiatives at the University of Tokyo. Even as the economics of coal have started to crumble, research has shown that as soon as 2025, it could become more cost effective for Japanese operators to invest in renewable energy, such as wind or solar, than to run coal plants. The government has stood by the belief that the country's utilities must keep investing in fossil fuels to maintain a diversified mix of energy sources. How a health aide won her ex-client's $283 a month apartment. Their relationship started the way many do. Marguerite Valentin needed help, and Eleonora de la O wanted a job. As a home health aide, Miss de la O warmed glasses of milk, took trips to the doctor, and held Miss Valentin's hand when she could not fall asleep. After a legal fight that lasted more than a year, Miss de la O, 62, won the right to the rent-controlled apartment where Miss Valentin had lived for about 60 years before she died. In Iraq, where beauty was long suppressed, art flowers amid protests. The first 5 floors have become one of a half dozen major art venues that have sprung up in Baghdad around the protest as painters, trained and untrained, have turned walls, stairwells, and littered parks into a vast canvas. The paintings, sculptures, photographs, and shrines to killed protesters are political art of a kind rarely seen in Iraq, where art has been made for at least 10,000 years. Luminaries of the Iraqi arts, actors and actresses, as well as musicians, painters, and sculptors, came together to record a tribute to the fallen protesters. Hong Kong tightens border as medical workers call for shutdown. Hong Kong's government said Monday it would close more border checkpoints as some medical workers went on strike to demand a complete ban on entries from mainland China to limit the outbreak of the new coronavirus, signaling concerns among business executives. More than half of American business leaders questioned said they want to see Hong Kong government shut down the border with mainland China, according to a survey of 156 executives by the American Chamber of Commerce in Hong Kong. A handful of explosive devices have also been placed around the city in recent days, followed by anonymous threats online of more bombs if the mainland border was not completely sealed. Some in Hong Kong's business community have also voiced concerns that if Hong Kong does not further tighten its border, it will be lumped in with mainland China by countries barring entry. Home at last from China, a foreign exchange student's travel ordeal. Jaden, a former high school student from Portland, Oregon, may have been among the last Americans to get out of China and clear security with ease. The nonprofit organization canceled all programs in China on January 31st. Bored with a high school in Portland, Jaden had hatched a plan to learn Mandarin. And graduate early so he could spend a year in China before college. Friends from Portland, Berkeley, Baltimore, and Abu Dhabi, places where Jaden had lived, were reaching out on Snapchat and WhatsApp to express concern about the risk of staying in China. U.S. officials promise aggressive measures to contain coronavirus. United States citizens who have visited mainland China will undergo a health screening and can be ordered to quarantine in their homes for up to 14 days, according to the Homeland Security Department. Howard Markel, a medical historian at the University of Michigan and the author of Quarantine, A History of Typhus and Cholera Epidemics in New York City in 1892, said he believed the current quarantine was a prudent decision given the spread of the virus In the hours and days before formal quarantine rules went into effect on Sunday afternoon, many families who had been traveling in China raced to get back to the United States. Beijing in the time of coronavirus. No traffic, empty parks, and fear. Beijing is not under a strict government-ordered lockdown like that in Wuhan and other cities at the center of the epidemic. Like most major cities, Beijing is a place of migrants seeking a better way of life. But now anyone from outside the capital has encountered open hostility, particularly those from Hubei province, the center of the outbreak. At Beijing's Capital International Airport, a new banner hanging in the concourse for the express train from the city center hailed those helping to contain the coronavirus. Coronavirus in New York. What we know so far. New York City health officials note that they have a long history of responding to contagious and frightening illnesses, going back to the days when outbreaks of cholera and smallpox threatened the city. At times, city officials have given different guidance than scientists at the CDC. At a news conference, Mayor Bill de Blasio said transmission of the new coronavirus required substantial contact with someone who already has it, adding that you don't get it from touching a surface. As anxiety over the new illness swelled, she encouraged New Yorkers to go about their daily lives, including those who have recently returned from Wuhan or elsewhere in China, so long as they felt fine and symptom-free. Brexit done? Not so fast. Britain and the EU enter new trade deal battle. Just 3 days after their formal parting, Britain and the European Union were already at loggerheads Monday over a future trade deal, setting the stage for months of bluster and bickering over how to refashion their economic and political ties. His uncompromising tone over trade underscored the scale of the challenge ahead. In Brussels, senior officials warned that a failure to agree to a new relationship again threatened a cliff-edge departure, a sudden change in trading rules that could damage businesses on both sides of the channel, but particularly in Britain. For now, Mr. Johnson is hanging tough, arguing on Monday that rather than accept alignment with European rules, he would prefer a trading relationship similar to that of Australia, which has no free trade agreement with the European Union. London stabbing prompts questions on policies for terrorism convictions. The British government proposed on Monday stopping the early release of hundreds of terrorism convicts after a succession of attacks by people let out halfway through their prison terms underscored long-festering problems with its anti-terrorist strategy. The government's aggressive plan was prompted by an attack on Sunday in South London, in which Sudesh Aman, 20, was accused of stabbing 2 people. On Monday, the Islamic State claimed responsibility for the attack, saying on the Hoop messaging app that the attacker was one of its fighters. The group had been using the messaging app since the authorities began a sustained effort to dislodge the group from Telegram, which had been its principal communication method since late 2014. Mr. Oman was wearing a fake explosive device, a tactic that has been used in several recent attacks, including others claimed by the Islamic State. Mercy flight leaves Yemen capital, cracking a 3-year blockade. A United Nations plane carrying 7 seriously ill Yemenis took off from the rebel-held capital, Sana'a, on Monday. What aid officials hope is the start of an ongoing humanitarian airlift to save the country's most desperate citizens. The airport in Sana'a has been closed to civilian traffic since 2015, effectively imprisoning thousands of Yemenis requiring urgent or complex medical treatment that the country's war-ravaged healthcare system is incapable of providing. Fighting in Yemen has eased for much of the past 6 months, as Saudi officials have engaged in back-channel talks with the Houthi rebels who control most of northern Yemen. including Sana'a, with the apparent goal of moving toward peace talks. Turkey launches deadly airstrikes against Syrian forces. Turkey deployed F-16 fighter jets against government forces in northwestern Syria on Monday, a sharp escalation of the conflict there after 6 Turkish soldiers were killed by artillery strikes. President Recep Tayyip Erdogan of Turkey said that as many as 35 Syrian troops had been neutralized. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, a monitoring group based in Britain, said the number killed was at least 13. The Turkish leader also warned Russia, which backs the Syrian government and which controls the airspace in western Syria, not to prevent Turkey from retaliating. Turkey has already taken in millions of people trying to escape the war, which started nearly 9 years ago, and is concerned that the Syrian push into the area will create a fresh surge of refugees. Violence must stop before Afghanistan peace agreement, Pompeo says. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said Monday that the Trump administration was moving ahead with peace talks with the Taliban to end the war in Afghanistan. Mr. Trump called off peace talks with the Taliban last September, but negotiations have restarted since then. What is President Trump accused of doing? He's accused of pressuring the... Audio captured Iran plane downing. That surely is the light from a missile. While the Iranian government has admitted that a unit of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards fired on the plane, it did so only after 3 days of stonewalling. In an interview with Ukrainian media, President Zelensky claimed that the exchange captured on the tape made clear that Iranian authorities knew almost immediately that a missile had brought down the plane, though the air traffic controller is the only government worker heard on the audio tape. Mr. Zelensky said the Iranian government had offered $80,000 to the families of each Ukrainian victim, but that he had rejected the offer as insufficient. Kansas City confusion. We're not in Kansas anymore. Or are we? President Trump did not waste any time Sunday night congratulating the Kansas City Chiefs for defeating the San Francisco 49ers in the Super Bowl, except he got their state wrong. Congratulations to the Kansas City Chiefs on a great game and a fantastic comeback. Under immense pressure, you represented the great state of Kansas. Yikes. And the entire USA so very well. Mr. Trump said in a tweet posted during his Air Force One flight from Palm Beach, Florida to Washington. Congratulations to the Kansas City Chiefs on a great and fantastic pressure under immense pressure. Whatever. Number of homeless students rises to new high, reports say. More than 1.5 million public school students nationwide said they were homeless at some point during the 2017 to 18 school year, the most recent data available, according to a report from the National Center for Homeless Education released last week. The 2017 to 18 number was more than double the nearly 680,000 homeless students reported in the 2004 to 05, the first school year examined by the center, its director George Hancock said. The Texas reported the largest increase over 3 school years, with the number of homeless students doubling to more than 231,000 in 2017 to 18. Fireflies have mating problem. The lights are always on. Many insects are affected by habitat loss, but fireflies have it particularly bad, said Sarah M. Lewis, a biology professor at Tufts and the lead researcher on the study. Insects provide a lot of services, said John Losey, a professor of entomology at Cornell University, who is not involved in the firefly study. The study did not lay out a time frame for the decline of fireflies, but Michael Reed, a biology professor at Tufts and a co-author of the study, said the insects are being lost steadily. Pelosi says Democrats have pulled back a veil on Trump's unacceptable behavior. Mr. McConnell managed to eke out the 51 votes he needed to prevent the Senate from subpoenaing witnesses like John R. Bolton, Mr. Trump's former national security advisor, whose forthcoming book confirms the allegations against Mr. Trump, calling Mr. McConnell a wholly owned subsidiary of the White House and Mr. Trump his puppeteer. Ms. Pelosi said the president has also tarnished the Senate. What is President Trump accused of doing? Blah, 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 blah. Waiting years for this night, then hours for an Iowa winner. On Monday evening, as the Byzantine system left results unreported well after state Democrats had predicted being able to lend some clarity, Iowa's precarious standing appeared to take another hit. The integrity of the results is paramount, Mandy McClure, spokeswoman for the Iowa Democratic Party, said in an initial statement as the wait persisted. All year, Iowa Democrats had grown consumed with identifying the candidate best positioned to counter Mr. Trump. America has had a year to learn how to say Buttigieg, and yet. One exception is President Trump, who has used the name to taunt the mayor at rallies. Boot Ed Jedge. Boot Edge Edge. You know that you pronounce it. I heard some guy say no, because it's an unpronounceable name. That's why they call him. Here the president shifted the timbre of his voice as if he were speaking in italics. Mayor Pete. Mayor Pete. Mayor Pete! He pointed to a place in the middle of his chest. Most people have trouble pronouncing my name, so they just call me Mayor Pete, he wrote in 2016. App used to tabulate votes is said to have been inadequately tested. The app that the Iowa Democratic Party commissioned to tabulate and report results from the caucuses on Monday was not properly tested at a statewide scale, said people who were briefed on the app by the state party. Any type of app or program that relies on using a cell phone network to deliver results is vulnerable to problems both on the app and on the phones being used to run it, he said. The state party said at the time that nearly all of the calls were related to user error problems, such as precincts in areas with bad cell phone service that were having difficulty downloading or logging into the app, or others simply asking about the app's functionality. Amy Klobuchar's caucus day in Iowa visit pays off. Then came the realignment, a frenetic 15-minute period that saw the viable candidates' supporters swarm like vultures into the sections reserved for Biden and Yang supporters. In the end, Ms. Klobuchar picked up the vast majority of Biden supporters here, adding 31 to her total in the realignment. Her new supporters included Ms. Shemp, the Biden precinct captain, and Greg McCabe, a 76-year-old retiree, who said Ms. Klobuchar was his second choice all along. Iowa's Republicans unite for Trump-Romney holdouts aside. Some 140 miles away, when the caucus captain at the Butcher Block Steakhouse in Cedar Rapids called out the two men standing in the very back of the room, the only two who had not raised their hands to support Mr. Trump, there was a very pregnant pause. Mr. Piper, a college freshman, is from a conservative evangelical family in the suburbs of Cedar Rapids, and said he had just finished reading George Orwell's novel, 1984. He saw some disturbing parallels between Orwell's dystopia and what he said was the hive mind of Mr. Trump's GOP. It's like a cult of personality, Mr. Piper said, adding that he felt compelled to vote against Mr. Trump now, even if he could not see him supporting any of the Democrats running for president. Before the vote in Waukee, Mr. Marwadell, the Walsh supporter, argued that Mr. Trump's expansive use of executive authority could have dangerous and unintended consequences. The gap between the haves and have-nots of tech widens. When Google's parent company, Alphabet, said on Monday that revenue at the company soared past $161 billion last year, it was a stark reminder of the widening gap between tech's wealthiest outfits and the rest of the industry. Tech's richest companies seem to be defying a Wall Street assumption that as a company gets bigger, it becomes difficult to find new ways to make money and maintain rapid growth. Over the last half-century, the biggest American companies have captured a fatter share of profits produced by public companies, according to research from Kathleen M. Call, a University of Arizona finance professor, and Renee M. Stoltz, an economist at Ohio State University. Deputy Secretary of Veteran Affairs is abruptly dismissed. In a sign of continued turmoil at the Department of Veteran Affairs, a deputy secretary in charge of key initiatives was dismissed on Monday, just as the agency rolls out complex changes to its healthcare system and a plan to address veteran suicide. As the second most senior person at the Department of Veteran Affairs, one of the government's largest and most historically troubled agencies, Mr. Byrne had broad authority over a number of sensitive issues and important initiatives as the department moves to direct thousands of veterans to healthcare providers outside the agency's legacy network. Last fall, a senior policy advisor on female veterans issues for the House said she was assaulted at the VA Medical Center in Washington, a complaint that was sent to the Inspector General, in part at the behest of Representative Mark Takano, Democrat of California and chairman of the Veterans Affairs Committee. The State of the Union is Trump's biggest speech. Who writes it? The annual address to Congress is an odd one in the Trump era because it's generally the only time of the year Mr. Trump consents to acting like a traditional president, or acting traditionally presidential, a performance that generally earns praise. Mr. Haley, 53, and Mr. Worthington, 31, have worked under Stephen Miller, the president's senior advisor, since the early days of the Trump presidency, adding historical sweep to Mr. Trump's annual speeches and funneling ideas from across the administration into cohesive drafts. Mr. Haley, a graduate of the College of William and Mary, spent a large part of his career with a production company run by Mr. Gingrich and his wife Calista, who was a campaign manager for Mr. Gingrich's presidential campaign in 2012. In the past, he has sought to frame Mr. Trump's speeches in the larger context of American history. His suggestion to shape Mr. Trump's first joint address to Congress around the anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence earned the president accolades. What will you do when the culture war comes for you? Did the executive director, Marty Baron, inquire about Ms. Sonmez's safety when he emailed her to criticize her tweets? What, beyond a reflex for online civility, led the Post to determine the reporter was hurting this institution by discussing a part of Mr. Bryant's legacy that appeared in the Post's own news pages? Why, after years of watching journalists, women, and vulnerable individuals being trolled and abused by viral outrage online, are newsrooms still falling for the same Gamergate-style tactics? The Post's official statement, which included the caveat, we consistently urge restraint for reporters online, doesn't begin to answer these questions. Inside publications, news and opinion bleed together. Opinion writers report while reporters opine via news analysis. The same editors who want restraint from the reporters online during a celebrity death would most likely also be furious if the Capitol Hill reporters were slow in live tweeting a hearing or impeachment proceeding and fell behind the competition. How zombies ate the GOP's soul. Voodoo economics has become unchallengeable doctrine within the Republican Party. Voodoo economics has completely taken over the party by the early 2000s, when Then House Majority Leader Tom DeLay declared, "Nothing is more important than in the face of war than cutting taxes." Climate deniers have ruled since at least 2009, when only 8 House Republicans supported a bill to limit greenhouse gas emissions. What recent events make clear is that zombie ideas haven't eaten just Republicans' brains. The lesson of a rescue dog. I can't remember when my dog finally stopped screaming. A gentle pat from a toddler or the friendly sniff of a tiny puppy can make this full-grown dog pee on herself in terror. People who haven't seen her in a while invariably make some version of the same observation. This is not the same dog I met last time, but she is the same dog. Are you in a gang database? I found out I was in a gang database, a shared criminal intelligence system used by policing agencies to store information on identifying gang members in 1996, after a dozen members of the Los Angeles Police Department crashed through my front door, self-identifying as a gang member, in addition to tattoos and officers' descriptions of gang-related clothing, are used to make a gang distinction. In 2016, an audit by the California State Auditor of CalGang, a database used to keep track of gang members across California, revealed that the system even included 42 gang members under the age of 1. Anticipating a Senate vote to acquit Trump, the Democrats knew they would probably never get the Senate votes to oust President Trump. Congress is filled with cowardly Republicans, terrified of President Trump and his Twitter fingers, comfortable with the notion of a president who cares for nothing but his personal gain. Carl Hulse asked if GOP senators would ever say enough when it comes to President Trump and his ostensibly wrong behavior. Mutual funds are still keeping secrets. It's almost as if the mutual fund industry doesn't want investors to assess the risks and costs of staying with the fund. The mutual fund industry should reconsider its rush to shut down the flow of vital information to investors. If the Commission lets mutual funds give less information to customers, we are sure to find that the next stock market downturn will be accompanied by the inevitable question from investors and politicians: why did regulators allow the mutual fund industry to stint on providing data to its investors about risks and costs? Who's afraid of Gwyneth Paltrow and Goop? The episode on female pleasure, led by masturbation queen Betty Dodson, is downright radical, featuring a vulva montage, naked women of various shapes and ages talking openly about their bodies, and a woman bringing herself to orgasm so that other women might learn how. The word science has morphed into a virtue signal, but science is simply a tool and can be used for both good and ill. How not to get hacked. Learning from Jeff Bezos. If Bezos can get hacked, you can too. Lays out a simple steps wealthy industry leaders can take to protect themselves against malicious actors. The hacking of the Amazon chief Jeff Bezos highlights a critical issue in corporate security. Consumer-based apps like WhatsApp are developed for entertainment and shouldn't be relied upon by senior executives for sensitive communications. Global companies need to use secure products designed for corporate use that prioritize security and privacy. The Bezos hack also underscores the fundamental issue of education. Businesses of all sizes, small and large, must ensure that employees are educated in threats like mobile phishing and offer guidelines on secure behavior. Good cybersecurity is not a one-time event, but an ongoing set of ingrained behaviors by every employee at every level in the business. I lost sleep over this building, a rush to make synagogues safe. Synagogues have struggled to find the money for security improvements that can range from relatively inexpensive one-time purchases like security cameras and locks to significant and locks to significant reoccurring costs like salaries for armed guards. Synagogues have tried to find the money by raising annual dues, adding new security fees for organizing fundraising drives. Mr. Cuomo said at the conference last week that he had included $25 million in new security grants in his proposed state budget, which is supposed to be approved by April 1st. He worked for Obama and Bloomberg. Could he be NYC's next mayor? Sean Donovan, a former housing secretary and budget director under President Barack Obama, filed paperwork on Monday to run for mayor of New York City. Mr. Donovan was housing secretary from 2009 to 2014 before becoming budget director until Mr. Obama left office. My life's work was shaped by seeing New Yorkers living on the street and getting left behind in the city, Mr. Donovan said in the interview. As for another white man jockeying to lead the city whose racial makeup is increasingly non-white, Mr. Sharpton said it would be undoubtedly an obstacle for Mr. Donovan, although not an insurmountable one. Jessica Mann, Weinstein accuser, breaks down in tears at trial. For hours, the lawyer Donna Rotuno had pressed Miss Mann on cross-examination about the details of consensual sexual trysts she had with Mr. Weinstein before March 2013, when Miss Mann said he raped her. The heart of the criminal indictment is based on the accusations made by two women, Miss Mann and Miriam Haley, who testified that he forced her to let him perform oral sex on her at his home in 2006. Prosecutors are using the account from a third woman, Annabella Sciorra, an actress who has accused Mr. Weinstein of raping her in 1993, to support the predatory sexual assault charge. Ms. Rotuno used Miss Mann's friendly emails to the producer to suggest it was Miss Mann who was using Mr. Weinstein and attempted to highlight inconsistencies in her testimony. I may have killed someone. Drifter charged in Upper East Side murder. Mr. Scott's court-appointed lawyer, Jessica Harani, said Mr. Scott does not remember much of the last few days and suggested he might have been deliberately drugged. After using Mr. Savinsky's credit cards to buy new clothes and to pay for taxi rides, Mr. Scott returned to the man's apartment the night after the killing, prosecutors said. Mr. Scott's lawyer in Oklahoma, Michael Manning, declined to comment, but said he did not expect to represent Mr. Scott in New York. Mr. Scott pleaded not guilty at his arraignment and is being held without bail. Disabled train and power failure brings delays for thousands at Penn Station. The evening commute was thrown into chaos for thousands of New Jersey-bound riders on Monday after a power failure disabled a train going into Pennsylvania Station in Manhattan, creating a cascade of cancellations and delays at North America's busiest train hub. The problems for New Jersey Transit began shortly before 5 p.m. when a train going into Penn Station became disabled, as did a rescue train that came in behind it, an agency official said. Midtown direct trains were diverted to Hoboken, and New Jersey Transit rail tickets and passes were being honored on PATH trains in Newark and Hoboken and at 33rd Street in Manhattan, as well as on agency buses. Tropical breezes, pristine beaches, and a domain name to die for. Every time a .ai name is registered or renewed by AI startups or by speculators hoping to resell the names to those startups, big companies or investors, the island collects a $50 a year fee, which goes mostly to the government treasury. 33% of startups had domain names or other than .com, more than double the percentage 5 years earlier, according to an analysis by Brex, which provides credit cards for startups. In 1998, the United States government led the creation of the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, a nonprofit that oversees domain names. IBM, Marriott, and Mickey Mouse take on tech's favorite law. The law passed with support from companies like Disney, Oracle, and IBM, but recent trade pact with Canada and Mexico contained Section 230-like protections, potentially locking in tech-friendly rules abroad. Now, critics of Section 230 are focused on pushing to keep similar language out of future trade pacts. Companies like Google and Facebook say that without Section 230 protections, building a business that gives individuals a platform for their content online would be impossible. The Washington lobbying group that represents companies like Marriott, Hilton, and Hyatt had backed a bill that would amend Section 230 so it didn't apply to home rental services in many cases. OPEC scrambles to react to falling oil demand from China. Over the weekend, officials from the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, as well as Russia, agreed to meet on Tuesday and Wednesday in Vienna, where OPEC has its headquarters, to discuss situation in the oil markets, according to two people briefed on the plans. Ms. Sen said China was already reducing its orders for March from Saudi Arabia, the de facto leader of OPEC and the world's largest oil exporter. Any slowing of these economies will sap demand for oil, hitting prices and the revenues that OPEC governments depend on. The national media mob descends on Iowa. Every spring, the Washington impresario, Tammy Haddad, hosts a charity brunch before the White House Correspondents' Dinner that is required stop for reporters, editors, network news anchors, and political operatives. Mayor Pete Buttigieg spokeswoman Liz Smith gossiped with executives from ABC and NBC. The 15-year-old son of Janice Min, the former U.S. Weekly and Hollywood Reporter editor, was on hand reporting for a group called Kid Unity. Bloomberg News threw a Super Bowl screening with an open bar and free chicken wings. After Oprah departure, film about Simmons' accuser finds new home. A documentary about the women who have accused Russell Simmons of sexual misconduct has found itself a new home after its original backers, Oprah Winfrey and Apple streaming service, dropped the film last month amid a pressure campaign by the hip-hop mogul. The film, on the record, will appear on HBO Max, a new streaming service from Warner Media set to launch in May, the company said in a news release on Monday. The announcement comes just over a week after the film debuted to glowing early reviews at the Sundance Film Festival in Park City, Utah, in January, and close to a month after Miss Winfrey removed herself as executive producer of the film and took her distribution partner, Apple TV Plus, with her. Rush Limbaugh reveals he has lung cancer. Advanced lung cancer. The conservative radio talk show host Rush Limbaugh said on his live show on Monday he has advanced lung cancer. "We are fighting with you, Rush." Mr. Limbaugh's cultural influence has been questioned by some listeners and sponsors. Mr. Limbaugh was admonished by ESPN in 2003 for suggesting that NFL player Donovan McNabb was being praised because the media was very desirous that a black quarterback do well. Mr. Limbaugh, who has said he started smoking cigarettes as a teenager but quit by the early 80s, and who has often been photographed smoking a cigar, questioned the link between smoking and cancer in 2015. Talkers, a trade publication covering talk radio, ranked Mr. Limbaugh as the second most important radio host of 2019 after his fellow conservative commentator Sean Hannity. Tribune Publishing CEO departs in management shakeup. Tribune Publishing, which also owns the New York Daily News, the Baltimore Sun, and the Orlando Sentinel, has been hit hard by elemental changes to the news business as readers embrace screens for their news, and Facebook and Google siphon away the majority of digital ad dollars. Mr. Knight, who had spent several decades in the news business, said he was looking forward to finding a new adventure. Mr. Jimenez, who had been finance chief since 2016, has spent several years working at news publishers, including a stint Newsday and several years at publisher of AM New York, a free daily paper. Coronavirus may delay hard-fought U.S. trade wins in China. Even with a deadly disease looming, China's failure to meet its commitments may create some opposition in the United States, potentially returning the countries to their rockier relations before the signing of the trade deal. Some in China have reacted negatively to the Trump administration's decision to restrict travel between the countries, excluding barring entry to all foreign nationals who recently traveled in China. Ms. Lovely said the virus, like the American tariffs on China, had been encouraging companies to examine their supply chains and invest in manufacturing some of the same products outside China, so they're not completely dependent on one source. YouTube says it will ban misleading election-related content. YouTube said on Monday it plans to remove misleading election-related content that can cause serious risk or egregious harm. The first time the video platform has comprehensively laid out how it will handle such political videos and viral falsehoods. Over the last few years, we've increased our efforts to make YouTube a more reliable source for news and information, as well as an open platform for healthy political discourse. Leslie Miller, the Vice President of Government Affairs and Public Policy at YouTube, said in a blog post. Graham Brookie, the director of Atlantic Council's Digital Forensic Research Lab, said that while the policy gave more flexibility to respond to disinformation, the onus would be on YouTube for how it chose to respond, especially in defining the authoritative voices YouTube plans to upgrade or the thresholds for removal or of manipulated videos like deepfakes. Tesla stock soars by more than $100. Tesla's share price has settled at $651 when markets closed on Friday. On Monday, Panasonic said that its joint battery venture with Tesla had turned a profit for the first time in the final quarter of 2019, according to Reuters, while a Chinese manufacturer of electric vehicle batteries, KATL, said it signed a supplier agreement with Tesla, which recently started delivering vehicles built at its Shanghai factory. On Saturday, ARK Invest, an investment research firm known for its extreme optimism for the car maker, said Tesla stock could reach $7,000 per share in 2024, while another analyst, Bill Selesky of Argus Research, on Monday upgraded his year-end forecast for Tesla's share price to $808 from $556. Despite past production delays, parts shortages, labor cost overruns, and other difficulties, we expect Tesla to benefit from its dominant position in the electric vehicle industry and to improve performance in 2020 and beyond, Mr. Selensky said in a note on Monday. Would your wages rise under Medicare for all? Regardless of what's on your pay stub, many health economists believe that your employer's contribution toward health insurance comes out of your wages. The economic theory that explains why employees foot the bill for health insurance is this. Whether it's in dollars or health insurance, what matters to workers is the total value of their compensation for work. Workers may not be willing to sacrifice already low wages for higher health care prices that don't reflect better health care. And that has been Reading the Times for Tuesday, February 4th, 2020.